Was this English gentleman truly tormented by the demonic face of his evil twin that eventually drove him to madness? Come and sit by me as we get into the tragic story of Edward Mordrake and the sinister oddity on the back of his head. Hey friend, how is your day going? I hope you are doing good and you are staying hydrated. Drink your water and your skin will thank you. If you're new around here, hello, welcome, hi. I'm Claire and I'm a lover of all things morbid, mysterious and macabre. I have spent hours and hours absolutely enthralled in ghost hunting TV shows, but you know what I love more than night vision footage and EVPs? I love the history behind a haunted house, the origins of urban legends, and the real, raw, personal ghost stories that people experience firsthand when they least expect them. So that is what we are going to do on this channel. Every week, we sit down and swap ghost stories like a good old sleepover. So if that sounds like a bit of you, then I would highly suggest that you subscribe so that you never miss one of our chats. I would hate for you to miss them. They're great. I found you excellent company. Today we are doing something a little different and we are looking into the story of an urban legend. And there's a little discussion online about whether this one is in fact real or not. So let's get into it and let's talk all about Edward Mordrake. So I think like every kid like growing up in the era of MySpace and Facebook, like I'd heard about this story when I was a bit younger and there were a few photos that had been like shared around on Facebook like years ago, but I was reminded of it when I was rewatching the American Horror Story Freak show a couple of weeks ago, and that scene on Halloween night when Elsa is singing Gods and Monsters by Lana Del Rey, like I freaking love everything about that scene. The green fog that's coming in, the freaks playing in the band, like the vintage vibe, and of course, the rather strapping portrayal of Mr. Edward Mordrake himself. Well done, Wes Bentley. Well done. Now, old Ed Mordrake isn't just a character from Ryan Murphy and Brad Falchuk's brain, though. Oh no. His story has actually been around for over 100 years. Edward Mordrake first made his appearance in the Boston Post newspaper on the 8th of December, 1895. The article was headlined "The Wonders of Modern Science" and described like a host of different characters that were, quote, half-human monsters once thought to be the devil's brood. And basically they were descriptions of what were called like human oddities, which were pretty commonly paraded around like during the late 1800s in like freak shows and things. So like if you were freakishly tall or short or fat or hairy or just had any form of deformity, then back then people would have paid to look at you. So in this article written by Charles Lowton Hildreth, he had compiled the most extreme cases of human oddities that the Royal Scientific Society had included in their reports. So okay, like all very official up to this point. Edward Mordrake was one of these characters described within the article about human deformities, amongst others like the Fish Woman of Lincoln and the Four-Eyed Man of Cricklade. The story goes that Edward was a very upper-class gentleman, like he was heir to like a noble peerage, which means that basically like his family was part of British nobility, which could have meant anything from like a baron or an earl to like even a duke. So like very high up in the social hierarchy of the time. But Edward Mordrake would never claim his family's peerage title. He was also described as being a man of like high attainments. He had accomplished many things in his life. He was clever, a very gifted musician. He was described as having a graceful figure, and his face was compared to Antinous, who was known for being particularly handsome. In spite of all of this, he lived in complete seclusion from everyone and wouldn't even allow his own family to visit him. The reason for all of this? Because on the back of his head, there was another face that occupied a small portion, like at the back of his skull. Now, it was said to be the face of a beautiful girl that was as lovely as a dream, but as hideous as a devil. Now, ever since he was a child, he would be subjected to relentless ridicule and cruelty for his tragic condition. But it wasn't just the other children that he was tormented by, because this face was thought to be intelligent, but evil. It would smile its unsettling, creepy smile whenever Edward was weeping, seeming to take joy in his misery. And if you were to like walk around behind Edward, the evil face's eyes would follow you around the room, constantly watching. Its lips would also constantly be gibbering like a lunatic, but you'd never hear a sound from it. Only Edward would hear the evil things that it would say, claiming that he would be kept awake all night by the sounds of hateful whispers from the twin that talked forever about things that they only speak of in hell. And apparently this devil twin, as he had come to call it, could whisper about dreadful temptations, trying to coerce Edward into committing unspeakable acts that went against his very nature. I mean, the guy was clearly at his limit. He was begging doctors to try and remove it, to crush it out of human semblance, even if it meant Edward had to die in the process. But obviously, where it was being attached to his head and most likely connected straight to his brain, his physicians just refused, saying the risk was too great. Which, I mean, makes sense. This is the late 1800s at this point. Medicine just hadn't advanced far enough to even begin to understand how they could safely remove it. And although it doesn't say for sure, it sounds like Edward had been housed in either a hospital or an asylum at this point. No doubt from the lack of sleep and the constant whispers from this evil twin driving him to madness. Somehow, even while under close observation, Edward managed to get his hands on poison and did the only thing that he could think of to escape his torment, and that was ending his life at the age of 23. His body was discovered along with a note that requested that the demonic face was destroyed before he was buried, so that he may finally rest in peace without its dreadful whispering continuing to haunt him for eternity. He was buried at his request in a waste place without so much as a gravestone to mark where he was laid to rest. And it is such a sad story of how this nobleman of such great talent and promise was driven to end it all because of his evil demonic twin. When this story was published in 1895, it seemed to capture the attention of readers worldwide. It was published in the Parsons Daily Sun in Kansas on the 11th of December, and then the Decatur Herald in Illinois picked it up on the 14th of December. And this was a time well before the internet. Fact-checking just wasn't a thing. So if you read it in a newspaper, chances are you would likely trust what it was telling you. Because the very next year, a literal medical encyclopedia referenced Edward Mordrake's story. And this encyclopedia was named Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine, and in chapter 5, titled Major Terrata, was all about malformations and deformities that had been recorded in the medical community were covered. And these were supposed to be verified real life cases. The encyclopedia referred to Edward Mordrake as a well-known story, and that it was of sufficient notoriety to be mentioned in the book, although they did admit that it had come from lay sources, indicating that there was no medical evidence to back up the story other than what the newspaper article had mentioned. So being featured in a medical encyclopedia alongside real, actual cases of deformities would have given credit to Edward Mordrake's story, cementing it as this tragic story of a birth defect that completely ruined a man's life. So Edward, as a human oddity, got published in this medical encyclopedia, but how true is this story? Biologically, can this even happen? Apparently, yes it can. Kind of. So there are a few theories on how something like this can happen. The first potential explanation is that it was a form of Craniopagus parasiticus, which is an incredibly rare birth defect where the parasitic twin is attached to a normally developed twin by the head. And this is slightly different to conjoined twins, who are both fully developed fetuses in the womb and will usually share organs and be connected by their bodies. And while parasitic twins are still classed as a form of conjoined twins, the parasitic twin will stop developing in the womb, while the other twin that it's connected to will continue to develop normally. Now, if you go and Google Craniopagus parasiticus, you won't have to look very far before you come across the case of the two-headed boy of Bengal, who was born in 1783. His parasitic twin's head was connected directly on top of his and was pretty much facing the opposite way. And this head, it had its own brain, it had a blood supply coming from the developed twin's brain membrane. So it was technically alive. And this may have given the impression that the brain could have been capable of independent thought. It could have been developed enough to have its own personality, and maybe even been an evil twin like Edward Mordrake's, maybe angry at the world for always facing backwards. I don't know. Unfortunately though, the Bengal boy's extra head seemed to be completely reflex. There was no sort of emotion or complicated thought. The eyelids didn't really close, not even when the other normal twin was asleep. It didn't have a neck either, so it didn't have vocal cords to be able to speak. And unfortunately, the poor boy was reported to have died of a cobra bite at the age of 4, and there's no report of him saying up to that point that he could communicate with his parasitic twin, or that like the twin was whispering to him only things that he could understand. But we definitely do know that this case is real, as the boy's skull is kept at the Royal College of Surgeons. So it's pretty close to Edward Mordrake's case, but like not quite there. Another theory that attempts to explain Ed's condition is a form of diprosopus, which is a Greek translation for duplication of face. So basically, like, this super rare congenital disorder is where some parts, or like an entire face, is basically like copied and pasted onto the same head. So it's things when you see like three-eyed cows and things like that. And that would kind of be like a little more like the way that Edward Mordrake was described, in that it was just like a second face and not like another, like a parasitic twin's head kind of thing. The problem with this theory is that while it's lumped in with conjoined twins, it's usually not due to two separate embryos, and it's actually just an anomaly in activity of proteins when the fetus develops. So like the extra features are actually just duplications and not a separate twin that's been absorbed. And it's a pretty big detail to mention too that these types of birth defects will obviously massively reduce the lifespan of the twins. There hasn't been a single case where any twin has survived even into puberty, like let alone to 23 years old. Most won't survive outside of the womb, with others dying like just a few weeks after birth. So even like the boy in Bengal, like he was super rare to have even lived to 4. So while it's not impossible, the likelihood of the demon face being a parasitic twin of the opposite sex, capable of intelligent thought, and 23 years old is extremely, extremely unlikely. So why does Edward Mordrake's legend continue to this day, with people still sharing his story on Facebook? Well, think about it. Like, it's sensational, it's tragic, it's intriguing, it's just got a hint of believability. And there is a carefully constructed reason for this. The article where Edward Mordrake was first introduced to the world in 1895 was written by a man named Charles Lowton Hildreth. And you want to know what he was famous for? I mean, aside from this article, which probably was his most famous work, Charles was a poet and an author of early science fiction. He wrote a book about a teenager finding a long-lost ancient civilization, as well as like some short horror stories. He was not a medical man or a historian or even a journalist. He made up stories for a living. He knew exactly how to weave words together to keep readers interested, with a hint of authority to make people believe it was real. One of the cases that was also mentioned in the article was the case of the melon child of Radnor, described as being an enlarged, dark red head with no eyes, ears or nose, and only a slit for a mouth, which could have been like a real child born with hydrocephalus, which is fluid on the brain, which would give the enlarged head, which then could have maybe been embellished to say that the baby was only a head and only had a slit for a mouth. Like, what I'm trying to say is that Charles may have had some medical inspiration for his article that he wrote, but in reality, it's an exaggerated work of fiction. Even the Royal Scientific Society, which sounds very official and would have probably given the article credibility back then, didn't even exist in 1895. It was founded in 1970 by the royal family of Jordan, 75 years after the article was first published. But this isn't the first time that the public have latched onto a fictional story and believed it as fact. In 1869, the petrified remains of a 10-foot tall giant were discovered in Cardiff, New York. People had flocked to the town to see the archaeological discovery, believing that it was one of the giants that were referenced in Genesis 6:4 of the Bible, which states that giants once walked the earth. Turns out it was a sculpture that was made to look like an ancient petrified man, and the whole thing was orchestrated by an atheist named George Hull, who had lost an argument with a bunch of Christians and now wanted to prove how gullible they all were. Hoax aside, that didn't stop the hundreds of people that wanted to see the giant. And even though it's all come out as like this massive hoax, the Cardiff giant is still on display at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York. And we can go even further than that. Like, there's even been like actual fictional stories that have been taken as fact and caused absolute panic. Like when Orson Welles broadcast a play on CBS radio that was based on the War of the Worlds. You know, the one where like the Martians like invade the Earth. Apparently, police were called, there was riots happening in the streets, and the station's switchboard was like lit up with panicked calls from all over the country. Everyone was calling up to ask if the Martians were going to be invading their town too, like how many people had have died already? Like, what should they do? Like, how do we deal with a Martian invasion? Even though the broadcast had mentioned multiple times that this was just a retelling of a very famous fictional story. The story of Edward Mordrake and his demonic second face is well over 100 years old now. So why does it still stir up like so much conversation today, with people still arguing about whether Ed actually existed or not? And I mean, as you can expect, the answer is mainly due to the internet and social media and the ease at which photos and information can be shared. I mean, there's no better way to make a story more believable than providing visual proof that Edward Mordrake's story is real. Along with a rendition of Ed's feature in the newspaper article, you'll usually see that famous black and white picture of Edward Mordrake and the second face on the back of his head. It's grainy and it's just low quality enough to be believable that it could possibly have been a photo of the man himself. The only problem though is that it's not. It's actually a wax model that has possibly been doctored to make it look more believable as a real person. There's also a colour image going around that could potentially be the same wax model as the black and white photo shows, but it looks slightly different. This most definitely is the same wax model that is displayed in the Panopticum Wax Museum in Hamburg, Germany. Another image that appears to follow the story of Edward Mordrake wherever he is shared is that of a skull, seeming to be like hard medical evidence of the anatomy of the two-faced man. Only this is also a sculpture. It was created by Tom Kubler, an American sculptor of the bizarre, and this skeleton is actually made from resin. The final image that appears to portray Edward Mordrake is the image of what is supposedly his severed, mummified head. The label at the bottom of the stand identifies it as the head of Edward Mordrake that is preserved for posterity by a P. Manvers. Come on, what am I going to say? What is it? That's right, it's another sculpture. This one is made from paper mache from the artist Ewart Schindler. And while I understand that there are so many people that want to believe the tragic story of Edward Mordrake, the reality is there is no physical evidence of a man living with the second head of his evil twin on the back of his head. So while the story of Edward Mordrake keeps people talking even to this day, the story is at best a wildly embellished case of a debilitating developmental defect in the womb, or at worst, and most likely, a completely made up story to keep newspaper readers interested. I know, I'm as gutted as you. But what do you think? Have you ever heard of the Edward Mordrake story before? When I was a kid, I fully accepted it as fact that Edward Mordrake was a real man, especially when I first came across the story with the photo of the black and white waxwork model. But yeah, now it makes for a really interesting urban legend, and obviously I absolutely loved it in American Horror Story. But when you're a kid, you believe those sorts of things, don't you? I'm pretty sure I saw Edward Mordrake along with a picture of the Elephant Man, who was very much real. So, I mean, if the Elephant Man can be real, then surely Edward Mordrake could be real, right? But let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this story, I would be forever grateful if you would hit the like button for me. And that goes for everyone's video that you see and enjoy on YouTube. It really does help creators. So just take a minute and leave a like if you like the video. I would love to see you back here for another story sometime, so maybe, I don't know, if you'd like to, you might want to subscribe. That would be super cool. And if there are any other urban legends or ghostly stories that you would like me to cover, let me know. I am always up for learning new spooky-ooky things. But that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more tomorrow, so until next time, sleep safe. Right, I definitely have a hair on me. Of course it's a cat hair.